The spring ball was the only night of the year when private longing was permitted to become public law. Courtship could be requested in any season, in gardens, in chapels, in quiet drawing rooms under the witness of family seals. But the spring ball was different. It was where houses made declarations before the kingdom, where alliances began, where refusals became gossip before midnight and contracts before dawn. The great hall of the palace had been dressed in pale gold and blooming silver vines. Musicians played from a balcony of carved ivory. Noble families gathered in layered silks and ceremonial jewels, each house marked by its colors, its sigils, its old pride. Between the formal proposals of dukes and heirs, Blake Beryl waited. He stood near one of the marble pillars, fingers closed around a small velvet case. He was 29, a seraphin of simple birth, with azure hair braided down his back and blue eyes too honest for court. White markings, proof of his kind, traced his skin like fine porcelain cracks, faint beneath the candlelight unless his emotions rose too high. Tonight, they glimmered. He tried to calm them. He had faced fever wards. He had held dying children through the night. He had cut into infected flesh with steady hands and pulled men back from death when even priests had stopped praying. Only months ago, he had perfected a cure for splenic rot, a disease that had taken thousands of children every year. People bowed to him in clinics now. Mothers blessed his name. The crown had called him indispensable. He had finally accomplished himself publicly. And yet, in that ballroom, with a courtship bracelet hidden in his hands, Blake felt like the village-born boy he had once been. Across the hall stood Lord Alaric Olson, an old noble Nephilim house, 24, short pale pink hair severely slicked back, red eyes, faint red markings across his skin, delicate as painted vines. He was beautiful in the cruel, effortless way ancient houses often bred beauty into their heirs like a second title. Blake had admired him for months. More than that, he had hoped. He had hoped for something that he thought he could see during the last months. Alaric had never refused him outright. He had accepted Blake's presence beside him at public lectures. He had allowed Blake to send flowers. He had smiled when courtiers whispered. When Blake's medical fame began to spread, Alaric had permitted their acquaintance to become more visible. That had been enough for Blake to believe there was a chance. A foolish chance, perhaps, but not an impossible one. Everyone knew. That was the worst of it. The entire court knew Blake Beryl intended to kneel. They watched him now with the hunger of people who sensed a scene before it happened. Blake inhaled. Then he crossed the hall. The music softened by chance or by malice. The conversations thinned. Jewels turned. Fans paused. Alaric saw him coming and did not move. Blake stopped before him. For one moment, all he could hear was his own heart. Then he lowered himself to one knee. A collective murmur passed through the court. Blake opened the velvet case. Inside lay a bracelet of silver and blue-green beryl gems, cut in the old Seraphin style. It was not merely jewelry. Among Seraphin, such a gift meant, *I offer you my name, I offer you my care, I offer you the truth of my devotion. *. His fingers did not tremble. "My Lord Alaric of House Olson," Blake said, voice clear despite the heat climbing his throat. "I ask permission to court you with honorable intent." The silence that followed was perfect. Alaric looked down at him. No surprise, he barely looked. His red eyes flicked once to the bracelet, then away, as though Blake had opened a box of trinkets in the street. "You presume far above your station," Alaric said. Blake went still, his eyes widened in horror. Someone inhaled sharply. Alaric's expression did not change. "Your achievements are admirable, Master Beryl, useful even. But usefulness is not lineage. My house requires a strong alliance, a name with weight, a bloodline capable of standing beside ours." Blake felt his markings begin to burn. His face went carefully blank, the blankness of someone that is forcing his emotions down. He bowed his head at once, praying the fall of his hair would hide them. "I understand," he said softly. It was not the hardest refusal he could think of, but it was still far from the softness he used to see in this man. But Alaric was not finished. Perhaps he should have been. A gracious refusal would have cost him nothing. A kind word, a respectful decline, a gesture toward Blake's service to the kingdom. Instead, Alaric allowed his gaze to move over him, cool and dismissive. I do not collect curiosities. The words spread through the hall like poison dropped into water. That was not only a reference to his simple birth, but also his race. Seraphins had mostly different magical ability. Not inferior, different. Curiosities.
For one suspended moment, Blake could not breathe. Then sounds came from around the ball. Not laughter, not openly. Nobles were too trained for that, but a shifting of silk, a swallowed gasp, a fan snapping shut, the subtle, exquisite violence of witnesses pretending not to witness too eagerly. Blake closed the velvet case. He kept his expression shut. His markings were starting to glow. He rose. He bowed, deep and formal. I apologize for troubling you, Lord Olson. His voice sounded very far away from him. Alaric said nothing. Blake turned, still holding the rejected gift. He intended to leave the hall without breaking. That was all. One step, then another, out through the doors, down the corridor, somewhere private, somewhere he could put his hands over his mouth and remember how to breathe. Then a chair scraped across marble. The sound cut through the hall. Everyone turned. At the high table, Roy Kennedy had stood, the head of House Kennedy, Marshal of the Kingdom. 32 years old, with long, dark red hair tied low at his back, red eyes, and red markings across his skin like embers beneath flesh. He wore black military formal wear rather than court silk, severe except for the crimson seal of his house at his throat. House Kennedy was the strongest military house in the realm. Ancient, feared, necessary. They did not flatter. They did not posture. They did not ask for anything they were not prepared to take by law, blade, or contract. And Roy Kennedy, youngest marshal in living memory, was not a man known for impulsive gestures. He was also unmarried and had already refused a dozen offers of courtship over the years. He stepped away from his chair. The hall parted for him before anyone consciously moved. Roy walked across the entire ballroom. He walked with purpose, a single destination. Blake stood frozen near the center of the hall, still holding the velvet case against his chest as though it might stop something inside him from spilling out. Roy stopped before him. For the first time that night, Blake looked up. The marshal's gaze was steady. There was no pity in it, no amusement either. Then Roy Kennedy lowered himself to one knee. The court forgot how to breathe. Blake's lips parted. "Marshal," he whispered. Roy looked up at him. "May I have what another man was too foolish to recognize?" The hall went so silent that the candles seemed loud. Blake stared at him, unable to understand the shape of what was happening. Roy's gaze moved briefly to the velvet case in Blake's hands. "But if it is not freely offered," Roy continued, "then I will not ask you to reopen a wound for my sake." From inside his coat, he drew out a bracelet, silver, deep blue-green beryl stones, not borrowed, not hastily chosen, made by a master jeweler, but designed in the Seraphim tradition with such precision that Blake's breath caught. Roy had known. He had prepared. "I have waited 3 years to ask," Roy said. A sound moved through the court, sharper this time. 3 years. Alaric's face changed. Only slightly, but enough. Roy did not look at him yet. His attention remained on Blake alone. "I did not ask because your regard was directed elsewhere," he said. "I would not step between you and a choice you had already made. A courtship begun by theft begins rotten. I would not have mine begin that way." Blake's markings flared white. Roy's voice softened. "But he has refused you publicly, before witnesses. Therefore there is no bond to respect, no hope to trespass upon, and no honor in my continued silence." Now he turned his head. Only then did he look at Alaric. And before House Olson remembers that pride often disguises itself as strategy, let me be plain. House Kennedy does not present a courtship gift for amusement. We do not ask twice. We do not make a public claim unless we intend marriage. Alaric's jaw tightened. Roy looked back at Blake. "I ask permission to court you, Blake Beryl, not because your cure made you famous, not because your name now carries influence, not because another man discarded you in front of the court." He held up the bracelet. "I ask because I have seen your hands save lives. I have seen your patience where others had only command. I have seen your courage when no one was praising you for it. Allow me to prove that I deserve you." Blake could not speak. His throat closed. The entire hall waited for his answer. He should have asked questions. He should have said this was too sudden. He should have protected himself from becoming the center of yet another spectacle. But Roy Kennedy did not kneel lightly. A man like that did not use devotion as theater. He didn't need to do that. Blake knew it with a certainty that settled beneath his ribs. He extended his wrist. "Yes," he said. The word was quiet. It carried anyway. Roy's expression did not change much, but something in his eyes warmed, deep and unmistakable. He fastened the bracelet around Blake's wrist. The beryl gems rested against Blake's pale skin, like captured sea light. Then Roy bowed over his hand, not to the court, not to the crown, to Blake, only to Blake. Across the hall, Alaric Olson stood very still. For the first time that evening, no one was looking at him. The next morning, every noble house in the capital knew that House Kennedy had claimed Blake Beryl. By noon, they also knew something more important. House Kennedy had not claimed him as a novelty, not as a healer useful to military contracts, not as a pretty seraphim whose sudden fame made him fashionable. They intended marriage. The effect was immediate. Those who had smirked behind fans at Blake's humiliation sent flowers to his residence with notes of admiration. Houses that had dismissed his low birth began to praise the benefice of seraphim magical abilities. Mothers who had warned their children not to grow too familiar with the physician now sighed over his refinement. Blake hated all of it. Roy seemed to expect that. On the second day of their courtship, he sent no jewels, no public poem, no dramatic carriage. He sent tea, a rare mountain blend from the northern monasteries, dried with blue citrus peel and white honey bark. Blake stared at the package for a long time. His assistant, Mara, leaned over his shoulder. "That is your favorite." "I know." "Did you tell him that?" "No." Mara grinned. "Interesting." The next gift was a bundle of pressed flowers from Blake's homeland, gathered from the cliffs where seraphim villages overlooked the eastern sea. Blake touched the pale petals carefully. The next was a book he had once borrowed from the Royal Library, so many times that the librarian had threatened to hide it from him. Then a set of hair combs made from smooth white horn, carved for long seraphim braids. Nothing excessive, nothing meant to purchase him. Every gift said the same thing: "I know you." When Roy called on him formally, he did not arrive with half the court behind him. He came with one aide, waited in the front room, and stood when Blake entered. "Good afternoon." "Good afternoon, Marshal." "Roy," he corrected, then paused. "Only if you wish." Blake studied him. Roy Kennedy, commander of armies, stood in his modest sitting room with the grave patience of a man awaiting military judgment. "Roy," Blake said, and smiled. He liked it. The marshal's shoulders eased by a fraction. Blake noticed. He began noticing many things. Roy never interrupted when Blake spoke about medicine, even when the explanation grew technical. He remembered the names of Blake's patients. He walked on the street side when they passed through crowded markets. At dinners, he quietly redirected conversation when noblemen tried to turn Blake's cure into a political argument. When musicians played too loudly at a reception, Roy asked whether Blake wanted to see the Winter Garden. Blake had not told him he was overwhelmed. Roy had simply seen it. In the garden, beneath pale lanterns and flowering branches, Blake finally asked, "How do you know all this?" Roy looked at him. The silence lasted long enough that Blake thought he might not answer. Then Roy said, "Because I have been paying attention." Blake's fingers tightened around the edge of his sleeve. "At the ball, you said? 3 years?" Roy's gaze lowered, not in shame, but in restraint. "That is longer than I had any right to hope." Blake said nothing. Roy continued, I first met you during the Western campaign. You were a volunteer healer, still finishing your studies, I think. Blake frowned slightly. The Western campaign had been chaos. Tents full of fever, men with wounds gone black, orders barked over screams. He had been 23 and too stubborn to obey anyone who told him a soldier was already lost. That was 6 years ago. I was a lieutenant then, Roy said, not marshal. Barely worth remembering. I took a spear wound under the ribs and a fever after. The surgeons marked me for death by morning. Blake went very still. His memory stirred something. His skin markings started reacting again. Roy's voice remained calm, but his eyes had gone distant. You stayed awake for 3 nights, against orders. You changed the dressings yourself. You argued with a field commander twice your size and told him rank did not outrank infection. When I woke properly, you were gone, but I couldn't forget your touch, your care. Blake remembered blood, mud, rain on canvas, a young officer with short red hair plastered to his face, burning alive from the inside. His mouth parted. That was you. Roy nodded once. I am sorry I did not recognize you. I know, and do not apologize. You treated hundreds of soldiers. The answer held no accusation. That was what hurt. Blake looked away, shaken by the quiet scale of it. 6 years. Roy had carried that memory for 6 years. Then found him at court, seen him hoping for someone else, and stepped back. You watched me court Alaric, Blake said. Yes. And you said nothing for 3 years. You had chosen. I had hoped, Blake corrected faintly. Roy accepted the correction with a slight inclination of his head. You had hoped, he said. I would not have tried to win you by making you doubt your own heart. Blake's throat tightened. Were you angry? At him, Roy asked. At me. Roy looked almost startled. No. The simplicity of it undid something in Blake. Roy looked toward the dark glass of the garden windows. Love cannot begin by stealing someone else's chance. Blake's white markings glowed softly in the lantern light. And now, he asked. Roy looked back at him. Now I will court you openly, patiently if you need patience, boldly if you ask boldness of me, but never carelessly. Blake's laugh came out unsteady. I am not sure I know how to be courted well. Roy's mouth softened. Then we will learn. Alaric Olson lasted 11 days before making his first mistake. He arrived at Blake's clinic with a bouquet of crimson lilies and the expression of a man prepared to be forgiven. Blake was reviewing patient charts when Mara entered, face pinched with distaste. Lord Olson requests an audience. Blake's pen paused, then continued, No. Mara smiled. I will enjoy saying that. Unfortunately, Alaric did not leave. He waited until Blake exited through the side courtyard near dusk. You are difficult to reach now. You used to seek for me, Alaric said. Blake stopped. Alaric stood beside the fountain, dressed in pale rose and silver, as beautiful and polished as ever. His red eyes moved immediately to the Kennedy bracelet on Blake's wrist. I am busy, Blake said, so I have heard. There was a tightness in Alaric's voice, not regret, not exactly, irritation. You made your refusal clear, Blake said. There is nothing more between us to discuss. Alaric smiled faintly. You cannot pretend this Kennedy spectacle is anything but retaliation. Blake stared at him. Retaliation? You were humiliated. He saw an opportunity. You accepted too quickly to think clearly. Blake's voice cooled. Be careful. Alaric stepped closer. I was first. That, more than anything, showed Blake who he was. He was not sorry for what happened. He was not ashamed either. He was simply offended that something he had declined had gained value after leaving his hand. You were never mine, Blake said, and I was never yours. Alaric's markings darkened. I disagree. There are precedents, he said. Multiple courtships may be considered when the first claimant has standing. Blake gave a soft, disbelieving laugh. You refused me before the court. I refused an improper public demand, not you. The lie was so elegant, Blake almost admired its craftsmanship. Almost. You called me a curiosity. Alaric's face hardened, and now you wear Kennedy colors as though born to them. Blake lifted his wrist slightly, letting the barrel stones catch the light. No, I wear them because Roy asked, and I accepted. The use of Roy's given name struck exactly where Blake intended. Alaric's eyes flashed. You think he will keep you once the novelty fades. Blake stepped back. Good evening, Lord Olson. Alaric's pride did not survive the dismissal. Within a week, rumors began. Not crude ones. House Olson was too careful for that. Instead, questions. Had Blake's cure been properly tested? Were his methods too experimental? Had the Crown granted him honors too quickly? Was it wise for the military to bind itself to a healer whose records had not been examined by noble physicians? The attack was delicate. The response was not. Roy Kennedy dismantled it in one afternoon. He requested a formal hearing before the Medical Council, the War Office, and the Crown's Witness Chamber. He arrived with battlefield records, patient survival numbers, letters from provincial governors, and signed testimony from hundreds of families whose children had lived because of Blake's cure. Then he called every physician who had whispered against Blake and asked them, one by one, to explain their objections. Most had none. Those who did were shown to have financial ties to rival treatments. Those who had repeated Olson's doubts without evidence were publicly censured. Then Roy turned toward Alaric's father, Lord Edric Olson, who had come expecting to observe the weakening of an inconvenient courtship. "My house is old," Roy said before the chamber. "I know the habits of old houses. We often mistake cruelty for discernment and arrogance for judgment. House Olson refused a man of proven service because he lacked the ancestry they wished to purchase. That is their right." His red eyes moved to Alaric. To then discredit his work after another house recognized his worth is not judgment. It is spite wearing a borrowed coat. The chamber fell silent. Roy placed one final document on the table. House Kennedy withdraws all pending military marriage considerations involving House Olson and its allied branches. We also advise our vassal officers to review the reliability of any house that cannot distinguish pride from policy. That was the blade. Several families shifted at once. Within days, courtships once directed toward Alaric were withdrawn politely and publicly. No one wished to bind themselves to a house that had misjudged the most powerful military alliance in the kingdom and then been humiliated for it. Lord Edric Olson scolded his son behind closed doors. The court heard about it anyway. Alaric did not apologize. Pride held him upright long after wisdom abandoned him. Roy's courtship did not change after the scandal. That was what convinced Blake most. He did not become possessive in victory. He did not parade Blake through court like a trophy taken from another man's table. He still asked before touching him, still listened, still arrived at the clinic when invited and left when Blake had work. But affection entered slowly, then everywhere. Roy learned how Blake braided his hair at night and began bringing ribbons in colors that matched the seasons. Blake learned that Roy took his tea unsweetened, except after battle anniversaries when he added honey and pretended not to. Roy's hair became one of Blake's quiet fascinations. It was long, far longer than military custom permitted, falling dark red down his back when unbound. One evening, seated before the fire in Roy's private study, Blake touched the end of it. "Why did you grow it?" Roy looked up from the report he was pretending to read. "Because seraphim do not cut their hair." Blake's hand stilled. Roy continued, "You consider hair sacred, not in the way temples are sacred, more intimate. Care given to the hair reflects care given to the beloved." Blake swallowed. "That is old custom." "It matters to you." "How would you know?" Roy's expression said the answer was obvious now. Because he had been paying attention. Blake looked at the long red strands between his fingers. "Doesn't military regulations require short hair?" They did. Blake's eyes lifted. Roy returned his gaze calmly. One of my first revisions as Marshal removed the requirement. It served no tactical purpose. It was tradition pretending to be discipline. I suppose no one knew why you changed it. No. Blake's markings flared bright. You changed a military regulation because of seraphim hair customs. Roy looked back down at his papers. I changed a useless regulation. I had reasons to change it before that. Only the timing was personal. Longer hair actually improves my control of lightning. I hypothesized that it must be true for most. Blake stared at him, then laughed softly, helplessly. Roy glanced up again. What? You are something else. Blake moved closer, still holding his hair. You knew me 6 years ago, found me again after 3, and waited another 3 years, overturned military grooming law, and sent me cliff flowers from my homeland. Yes. And you say it like you arranged a filing cabinet. Roy's mouth twitched. It was a very inefficient filing cabinet. Blake laughed again, and this time Roy smiled. That night, Blake braided Roy's hair for the first time. Roy sat utterly still through it, as though entrusted with something more delicate than command. When Blake finished, he rested his hand briefly at the nape of Roy's neck. Roy closed his eyes. The gesture lasted only a moment. It changed everything. Their wedding took place at the height of summer. By then, no one questioned whether Blake Beryl deserved House Kennedy. At least, no one did so aloud. The ceremony filled the Capitol Cathedral with soldiers, nobles, healers, foreign envoys, and common families who had traveled for days to stand outside and cheer the physician who had saved their children. Blake wore white and deep blue-green, his azure hair flowing freely and adorned with silver thread. His markings shone softly across his skin. Roy wore black and crimson, hair unbound for the first half of the ceremony in honor of seraphim custom. They stood beneath the ancient arch while the royal witness read the marriage articles. It was still very much a state affair. Then came the old noble rite. Roy removed his gloves. A priest approached with a basin of clear water and a crystal kriss. The hall quieted. Blake had known about the seal. He had read about such things in medical histories. Ancient contraceptive marks placed on noble children to prevent heirs outside sanctioned marriage. Most houses still used them, though few discussed it openly. Roy's seal had been placed when he was 7. A red seal lay beneath the skin over his lower abdomen, dormant and precise. Blake had seen wounds, infections, birth complications, battlefield amputations. Still, when the priest touched the crystal blade to the seal and Roy's breath caught, Blake's hand tightened around his. Roy did not flinch. The sigil unraveled like a thread of red light drawn from beneath the skin. The cathedral watched. The kingdom watched. House Kennedy's bloodline, bound for 25 years, was released in Blake's name. Roy's grip remained firm. Only Blake felt the faint tremor in his fingers. Afterward, when the vows were spoken and the house seals joined, Roy bent his head. Blake met him halfway. Their first kiss as husbands was not dramatic. It did not need to be. The cathedral erupted anyway. Outside, the soldiers struck their swords against their shields until the sound rolled through the Capitol like thunder. That night, Roy Kennedy was nervous. Blake discovered this with astonishment and no small amount of delight. The Marshal of the Kingdom, the man who could make generals pale with one quiet sentence, stood in their wedding chamber with his hands folded behind his back as though awaiting inspection. Blake closed the door. Roy looked at him, then looked away. Blake's brows rose. Are you flustered? No. You are. I am considering several matters. Are any of them military? No. Then you are flustered. Roy exhaled slowly. Blake approached him, smiling despite the sudden tenderness in his chest. Roy could face blades, politics, scandal, and public ceremony without blinking. But here, stripped of command and witnesses, he seemed younger, not weak. Never that vulnerable. It made Blake ache to be able to witness it. You have never done this, Blake said softly. Roy's jaw shifted. No. Blake touched his sleeve. Neither have I. Roy looked at him then. Blake smiled. But I am a doctor. A pause. Roy's eyes narrowed slightly. That sounds ominous. It means I know the body. That did not make it less ominous. Blake laughed and stepped closer. It means we do not need to rush. Roy's shoulders loosened and he smiled. Blake reached up and began unfastening the clasp at Roy's throat. The marshal held still. "You may tell me to stop," Blake said. He unbuttoned his jacket slowly, unhurriedly. "You may tell me to slow down." He slid it off Roy's shoulder when it was completely unfastened. "You may also stop looking as though I am about to perform surgery." That startled a laugh out of Roy. A laugh, a real one, low and brief, but warm enough to make Blake's breath catch. There was nervousness there, but also the release of tension. "You referenced your profession first." Blake grinned. The night unfolded slowly after that, as slowly as two souls discovering new territory. Roy with the strategic thinking of a battlemaster, and Blake with the curiosity of a scholar. Blake was shameless in the way only an honest person could be shameless. He said what he wanted, asked what Roy liked, watched his reactions with focused, devastating attention. Roy, who had spent his life mastering control, found himself undone not by force, but by care. By morning, Roy's long red hair was tangled across Blake's pillow. Blake woke with Roy's arm around his waist and the unfamiliar certainty that he had not been chosen for convenience, alliance, or spectacle. He had been loved, patiently, deliberately, for years. Marriage gave Blake the Kennedy name. He used it immediately. Not for vanity, for leverage. The military hospitals were the first to change. Security protocols were rewritten after Blake toured 3 barracks and found medicine stores unsecured, surgical instruments improperly cleaned, and wounded men sleeping too close to fever patients. Care rotations were adjusted. Field sanitation rules were strengthened. Recovery tents were reorganized by injury type rather than rank. The older brass muttered, and after the infection rates dropped, they muttered less, because it came with less expenditure for overall. The true battle came 6 months later. Blake stood before the War Office with a proposal in hand. "I want the medicine distributed freely," he said. General Voss, gray-bearded and permanently offended, frowned at the document. "To all soldiers." "Yes." "For a venereal disease." "For a sexually transmitted infection," Blake corrected. "Curable in most cases with proper treatment." Several officers shifted uncomfortably. The question of the transmitted infections between soldiers has been brought up for several years, decades even. But nothing changed. Voss's frown deepened. "This will encourage unbecoming activity among the men." Blake looked at him with a calm expression that had terrified many patients into obedience. "No, it will cure them." A younger colonel coughed into his fist. Voss glared. "You are naive if you believe removing consequence improves discipline." Blake's blue eyes sharpened and his tone dropped. "I am a physician. I do not use disease as discipline." Silence. Heavy and guilty. At the head of the table, Roy sat with one hand resting near his mouth, watching the exchange without interrupting. Blake continued, "A third of the active barracks show symptoms or complications. Men are hiding illness because they fear disgrace, shame. Untreated infection causes pain, weakness, infertility, fever, and in advanced cases, death. You are losing readiness because shame is apparently more sacred to this office than health." Voss went red. "This is not a clinic of peasants, Lord Kennedy." Roy's hand lowered. The room chilled. Voss realized his mistake half a second too late. Blake smiled faintly. "No," Blake said. "Of course not. It is worse. Peasants come to me before officers do because peasants are less afraid of paperwork." One of the colonels made a strangled sound. Roy looked at him. The colonel became silent. Blake placed the proposal on the table. "Distribute the medicine. Quietly. Freely. Without moral inquiry. Add education on symptoms and prevention. Allow men and women to seek treatment without punishment. unless coercion or assault is involved. Voss opened his mouth. Roy spoke for the first time. "My husband's proposal is approved." Voss stiffened. "Marshal?" Roy's red eyes turned to him. "Did you mistake this for a debate?" The policy passed. Within 3 months, morale improved so sharply that even the old officers could not pretend to see it. Sick reports decreased, fights in the barracks lessened, men who had been suffering in silence returned to full strength. Loyalty to command deepened in a way no speech had ever achieved. Because the soldiers had been heard, the policy expanded to all provinces. It was the first reform, not the last. Blake became a familiar presence in military hospitals, then training yards, then policy chambers. Soldiers who had once stood rigid around him began bringing him questions, injuries, worries. Some called him Lord Kennedy. Others, when Roy was not nearby, called him the Marshal's Mercy. Roy heard once. He said nothing, but his expression stayed strange for the rest of the day. The pregnancy was not planned so soon. At least, Blake insisted it was not. Roy looked at him over breakfast with the careful neutrality of a man aware that his husband was both a physician and dangerous before tea. "You are certain?" Roy asked. Blake stared at the test results, then at Roy, then back at the results. "Yes." Roy rose halfway from his chair, stopped, sat down again, stood fully. "Roy," Blake said, "I am calm. You are standing like the palace is under siege." Roy looked toward the door. "Should I call Mara?" "I am the doctor." "You should not have to doctor yourself." "I am pregnant, not wounded." Roy absorbed that with visible difficulty. Then Blake's expression softened. "Come here." Roy did, slowly. Blake took his hand and placed it over his lower abdomen. "There," Blake said quietly, "your child." Roy stopped breathing. For once, he visibly lost control over his skin markings. They flared, just a fraction, but visible enough for Blake. All the command left his face. For a moment, he was only the man who had waited 3 years, the man who had knelt in front of a ballroom, the man who had trembled once, almost imperceptibly, when his childhood seal was undone. His hand spread carefully over Blake, as though warmth alone required permission. "Our child," Roy said. Blake's markings glowed. "Yes, our child." The court reacted exactly as expected. Male pregnancy existed among Seraphim and Nephilim lines, but it was rare, politically charged, and heavily policed by noble custom. Such pregnancies often produced powerful heirs. Old houses considered them matters of bloodline strategy, not personal joy. Blake's simple birth became a weapon again. There were whispers that he had risen too fast, that Kennedy blood should have been joined to an older family, that a village-born Seraphim carrying the Marshal's heir was an instability disguised as romance. The military responded before Roy needed to. Officers who had once resisted Blake's reforms now closed ranks around him. Soldiers stood guard outside clinics where he worked. Veterans sent letters to the palace. Entire companies signed declarations affirming Blake's service, his title, and his place in House Kennedy. One anonymous pamphlet questioning the legitimacy of the pregnancy vanished from circulation after its printer was visited by 6 captains, 2 surgeons, and a quartermaster with a very detailed knowledge of tax violations. Roy was less subtle. When a minor lord suggested before witnesses that Blake's upbringing made him unfit to bear a Kennedy heir, Roy turned to him with a stillness that made nearby nobles step back. "Say that again," Roy said. The lord went pale. Blake, seated beside Roy, touched his wrist. "Roy!" The marshal did not look away from the lord. "I would like him to say it clearly." "He will not," Blake said. "No," Roy agreed. "He will not." The lord fled the capital before dawn. Blake later found Roy in his study, standing over a list of names. "That looks ominous," Blake said. Roy did not deny it. "I hope you are not calling for blood." "I am setting matters straight." "Roy." His husband looked up, eyes burning. They are circling you because they think pregnancy makes you softer prey. Blake crossed the room and took the list from his hand. I am nor prey nor fragile. Roy's gaze dropped briefly to Blake's abdomen. You are carrying everything I have ever wanted. That quieted him. Blake folded the list and set it aside. Then protect me intelligently. Roy inhaled, then nodded once. The next week, 3 hostile houses found their military contracts reviewed, delayed, and in one case revoked entirely for irregular supply records. No blood was spilled. The message landed anyway. The twins were discovered by accident. Blake was 5 months along and deeply annoyed by everyone's insistence that he rest. He had allowed an examination only because Roy had worn the expression of a man silently preparing to carry him bodily to the physician. The attending healer gently put her hands upon his belly. They glowed briefly, then stopped, then again. Her brows lifted. Blake narrowed his eyes. What? Roy went rigid. The healer smiled. My lords, she said, there are 2 heartbeats. Blake blinked. Roy sat down, hard. Blake turned to him in alarm. Roy. I am calm, Roy said faintly. You are gripping the chair hard enough to crack it. The healer cleared her throat. He has cracked it. Blake looked down. One of the carved wooden arms had split beneath Roy's hand. For a moment no one spoke. Then Blake began laughing. He laughed until his eyes watered, one hand over his stomach, while Roy stared at the broken chair as though it had betrayed him. Twins, Blake said. Roy looked at him. The panic in his face slowly transformed into wonder. Twins, he repeated. After that, his devotion became nearly unbearable. He monitored Blake's meals, his sleep, the temperature of rooms, the width of staircases, the number of people permitted to approach him at court. Blake tolerated some of it, corrected much of it, and secretly loved more than he admitted. At night, Roy brushed and braided Blake's azure hair with reverence, his large hands careful through every strand. The old Seraphin custom no longer belonged to observation. It lived between them now. Care for the hair, care for the beloved. Sometimes Blake would watch him in the mirror. You really waited, he said once. Roy met his eyes in the glass. Yes. All that time. Yes. Even when I was foolish. Roy tied the braid with a white ribbon. You were hopeful. Blake's throat tightened. Roy bent and kissed the crown of his head. I love that about you, too. The boys were born during a storm. Rain lashed the windows of Kennedy House while soldiers filled the courtyard below, silent and soaked, refusing to leave until word came. The whole city was aware of it. Roy remained at Blake's side through all of it. He held his hand, took orders, endured Blake cursing him with impressive medical precision, threatened one healer only once and apologized when Blake glared at him. Then the first child cried. A son, red hair damp against his tiny head, black eyes. The room went silent, save for the baby's soft first cries. True black eyes were rare, not dark brown, not shadowed red, black, pure as midnight glass, a sign of old power, deep inheritance, and dangerous magical capacity. Then the second child was born. Another boy, red hair, gold eyes. That was even rarer. Gold eyes promised the rise of a unique fractal, maybe something that no human had ever seen, but they will only know during his 5th year. One impossible child was already the miracle of a generation. But 2, is it possible Seraphins had that in their blood? For once in his life, Roy Kennedy had no words. Blake, exhausted and pale, looked down at the twins placed against him. They look like you, he whispered. Roy sat beside him, one arm around Blake, one trembling hand touching the nearest child's hair. They have your stubbornness, he said. They are 5 minutes old. I can tell. Blake laughed weakly. Outside, the bells began, one tower first, then another. Then the entire capital seemed to wake beneath the storm. The soldiers in the courtyard erupted when the announcement came. 2 sons, both healthy, their lord safe, Their marshal a father twice over? Roy lowered his forehead to Blake's shoulder. The gesture was private despite the room around them. Blake turned his face into his husband's hair, long, dark red, uncut, because years ago a lieutenant had remembered a healer who stayed awake for 3 nights to save him. "You waited," Blake murmured. Roy closed his eyes. "I told you," he said. "I spent years respecting another man's courtship." One of the twins made a small sound in his sleep. Roy lifted his head and looked at Blake as though the whole kingdom had narrowed to this bed, this breath, this impossible mercy. "The moment he threw you away," Roy said softly, "I finally allowed myself to move." Blake touched his cheek. "And if he had not?" Roy's answer came without hesitation. "Then I would have wished you happiness." Blake's markings glowed, faint and white as dawn. He looked at the 2 children between them, then at the man who had loved him first as a memory, then as a hope, then as a choice freely made. "You may have what he was too foolish to recognize," Blake whispered. Roy turned his face into Blake's palm and kissed it, remembering the first words he had spoken to this man. "No," he said. "I was allowed what you chose to give." Outside, the storm broke over the Capitol. Inside Kennedy House, beneath the sound of bells and rain and soldiers cheering in the dark, Blake smiled. For the first time in his life, he did not feel elevated by another person's power. He felt seen. And Roy Kennedy, who could have taken almost anything he wanted from the world, held his husband and sons with both arms and asked for nothing more.